For 50 years, one man stayed silent while the world blamed someone else. Now, at 83 years old, Paul McCartney is finally breaking that silence. The truth he's about to reveal will shake everything fans thought they knew about the Beatles. It's not about the woman everyone pointed fingers at. It's about four men who slowly became strangers. And the decision that no one was brave enough to make first. When John Lennon walked into that room in 1969, nobody knew it would be the last time. He didn't yell. He didn't break anything. He just said he was leaving. And then, nothing. Complete silence. The band that changed the world didn't even tell anyone. They just kept pretending. They went to the studio. They played gigs. They smiled for the cameras. But it was all falling apart behind the scenes. Paul knew the truth. He knew John had already made his choice. But he didn't say a word. Not to the press. Not to the fans. Not to anyone. Because saying it out loud would mean admitting that the Beatles were over. And admitting that meant watching everything collapse in public. So he did the hardest thing, he kept quiet. He let people think he was the one who broke up the band. He let the world believe he was selfish, ambitious, power-hungry. He carried that weight for 50 years. His wife knew. His closest friends knew. But the rest of the world? They believed the lie. They believed Paul McCartney destroyed the most important band in music history. Every interview, every award, every moment of success came with that shadow following him. People looked at him differently after that day. The guilt was crushing. But he thought it was worth it. He thought protecting the Beatles' legacy was more important than protecting himself. Now, decades later, Paul is ready to tell what really happened. Not the version fans heard. Not the story the media created. But what actually went down when four young men realized they couldn't be brothers anymore. The real reasons. The hidden tensions. The choices that nobody talks about. And why the person everyone blamed was never the real problem. This is the story the Beatles never told. By the late 1960s, the Beatles weren't the carefree kids anymore. They were men with different dreams. The unity that made them unstoppable was fracturing in ways nobody wanted to admit. The cracks didn't appear overnight. They were forming slowly, quietly, building up pressure that nobody knew how to release. When they stopped touring in 1966, something fundamental shifted. Before that, they were a live band. They fed off the energy of screaming crowds. They were together every single night, traveling, laughing, surviving together. Touring was brutal, but it kept them bonded. Then it all stopped. They went into the studio and never left. The studio was different. It was cold. It was controlled. There were no fans cheering them on. No adrenaline. No sense of being a team against the world. Instead, there was just four men staring at each other across expensive equipment. And slowly, they realized they didn't want the same things anymore. John was changing. He was getting deeper into experimental music, into art, into pushing boundaries. He wanted to destroy the rules and rebuild everything from scratch. Paul wanted to protect what they had built. He wanted to make it better, more polished, more perfect. But John saw that as boring. He saw Paul as controlling. That tension grew with every session. But here's what nobody talks about: George was watching all of this. And George was angry. Not at Yoko. Not even really at John or Paul. George was angry at being invisible. He had written some of the most beautiful songs the Beatles ever recorded. Something. Here Comes the Sun. Songs that made people cry. But he was fighting for studio time like he was a junior member. Lennon and McCartney got unlimited space to create. George got leftovers. That was only the beginning. Everything changed when Brian Epstein died. Their manager, their guide, their father figure, gone. Suddenly, there was nobody steering the ship. Nobody making the hard calls. Nobody keeping the peace. And that's when the real fighting started. Not about music. About money. About who got to decide the future of the Beatles. Everything became about control and power instead of art and brotherhood. The four of them weren't even in the same place anymore, mentally. They were orbiting each other, getting farther apart with every passing month. Paul felt it. He knew something was dying. And he kept trying to fix it, kept pushing harder to hold it together. But the more he pushed, the more the others pulled away. What happened next would destroy everything they built. John Lennon was suffocating. By 1969, he felt like a prisoner inside his own band. The man who once sang about revolution was being held back by rules, expectations, and the weight of 4 decades of Beatlemania. He wanted to break free, but the Beatles wouldn't let him. Or so he felt. The truth is, John was going through a transformation that nobody could have stopped. He was reading new books, exploring new ideas, meeting new people. He was becoming someone different from the kid who started this whole thing. The Beatles made sense when they were all growing together. But now they were growing in completely different directions. Then he met Yoko. And everything shifted. She wasn't just a woman to John. She was a mirror. She reflected back the parts of him that were dying to get out. She was an artist. A thinker. A rebel. She didn't care about the Beatles or the music industry or any of it. She saw John as a human being first, not as a Beatle. That was intoxicating to him. For the first time in years, he felt like he could be himself without apologizing. But that came with a cost. John brought Yoko into the studio. He needed her there. He wanted her in every session, every moment, every creative decision. To the other three, it felt like an invasion. This was their space. Their sacred place. And now there was a stranger, well, John's girlfriend, sitting in the corner, offering opinions, changing the energy. George hated it. Paul struggled with it. Ringo just felt more alone. John didn't see it that way. He saw a man and a woman who loved each other, trying to create together. He didn't understand why that was so threatening. But it was. Because it meant John was pulling away from the band. He wasn't 100% there anymore. His attention was divided. The real decision came quietly. John didn't sit down and write it out or plan it carefully. It just happened. He realized he didn't want this anymore. He didn't want the meetings about money. He didn't want to compromise his art. He didn't want to be in a band where he felt trapped. He wanted to explore, experiment, and push boundaries without anyone telling him no. So one day, he said it. I'm leaving the Beatles. Just like that. For words that would echo through history. The others were shocked. Paul went silent. George felt relieved and hurt at the same time. Ringo didn't know what to say. And then something strange happened. They all agreed not to tell anyone. They decided to keep it secret. To protect the brand. To protect the money. To protect the image of the Beatles as unbreakable. But they were completely broken. That silence would become Paul's greatest burden. The world needed someone to blame. And Yoko Ono was standing right there. She became the perfect villain for the story nobody wanted to believe. The outsider who ruined the greatest band in history. The woman who seduced John away from his brothers. The reason the Beatles fell apart. It was a simple story. It was wrong. But it was easy to believe. What people didn't understand was that Yoko didn't break the Beatles. She just made the breaking visible. She walked into a room that was already on fire. She didn't start the fire. She just couldn't ignore it. By the time Yoko appeared in John's life, the Beatles were already cracking. The tensions had been building for years. The resentment was real. The distance was growing. John was already searching for something outside the band. He was already unhappy. He was already changing. Yoko didn't cause any of that. She just became the person John turned to when he realized the Beatles couldn't give him what he needed anymore. But here's what makes people angry, she was there. Every session. Every moment. Breaking an unspoken rule that outsiders didn't belong in the studio. The Beatles had always been just the four of them. Sacred. Private. And now there was someone else in the room. Someone who questioned things. Someone who didn't worship the Beatles like the rest of the world did. That threatened everything. What nobody realized was that John asked for this. He wanted Yoko there. He needed her there. He brought her into the studio deliberately because she made him feel alive. With her, he wasn't a Beatle. He was just John. And for the first time in years, he wanted to be just John. Paul admits now that they didn't know how to handle it. They felt invaded. But that was their problem to solve, not Yoko's problem to fix. She didn't owe them anything. She was supporting the man she loved. That's not evil. That's not destructive. That's just love. The real damage wasn't Yoko sitting in the studio. The real damage was that the Beatles couldn't adapt to change. They couldn't accept that John was evolving into someone new. They couldn't let go of what they used to be. And instead of facing that truth, they found someone else to blame. Yoko became the scapegoat for a much bigger story. A story about four men who grew up together and then grew into different people. A story about success that isolated them instead of bringing them closer. A story about the cost of staying together when staying together was killing you. She didn't destroy the Beatles. The Beatles destroyed themselves. And then they blamed her for watching it happen. The music was falling apart, but the real killing blow came from the business side. When Brian Epstein died in 1967, something essential died with him. He wasn't just a manager. He was the glue. He protected them from the ugly side of the music industry. He made the hard decisions so they could focus on creating. Without him, everything fell apart. Suddenly, for musicians had to make business decisions they had no idea how to make. And they couldn't agree on anything. This is where the story gets messy. This is where brothers became enemies. Paul wanted to bring in Linda's father, Lee Eastman, to manage the band. Lee was a lawyer. He was family. Paul trusted him. But John, George, and Ringo said no. They wanted Alan Klein instead. Klein was a ruthless businessman who promised them control and money. He told them what they wanted to hear. He made them feel powerful. This should have been a simple business decision. It wasn't. It became personal. It became about who had the right to control the Beatles' future. It became about who really ran the band. And suddenly, it wasn't four friends making a choice together. It was 3 against 1. Paul versus everyone else. The tension exploded into a legal battle. Paul actually sued the other 3 members of the Beatles. His own brothers. To protect their music from being mismanaged. To keep their work from being stolen or destroyed by Klein. But to the world, it looked like Paul was being selfish. Like he was power-hungry. Like he was the villain tearing apart the Beatles over money. Nobody understood what was really happening. Paul wasn't fighting to control the Beatles. He was fighting to save them. He saw what Klein was doing. He saw how Klein was manipulating John and George. He saw the disaster coming. And he tried to stop it the only way he knew how, through the courts. But that lawsuit became the final nail. It made the breakup official. It made it real in a way nothing else had. The Beatles didn't just break up. They sued each other. They fought in public. They aired their dirty laundry. The family was completely shattered. What Paul reveals now is that he never wanted that fight. He never wanted to sue his bandmates. But he also couldn't stand by and watch everything they built get destroyed by someone who didn't care about their legacy. So he made a choice. He chose to be the bad guy if it meant protecting the music. That choice cost him everything. Fans hated him for years. The Beatles hated him. The media destroyed him. But the music survived. And Paul has spent his whole life wondering if it was worth it. Everything changed the moment the lawyers got involved. At the beginning, the Beatles were one. They thought the same way. They wanted the same things. They were hungry, ambitious, and completely unified. But success does something strange to people. It gives you options. And options force you to choose. By the late 1960s, these 4 men were choosing completely different paths. Paul wanted to keep perfecting the music. He wanted to explore new production techniques, new sounds, new ways to push what a rock band could be. He was obsessed with the craft. Studio time felt like home to him. He could spend hours getting one drum sound right. He believed in discipline and precision. That's what made him great. But it also made him restless. He always wanted more. Always wanted better. John wanted to break everything and start from scratch. He was done with perfection. He wanted raw, honest, chaotic music that reflected real life. He wanted to scream and experiment and fail. He didn't care if it sounded polished. He cared if it felt true. By 1969, he felt like Paul was suffocating his creativity. Like every song had to be a hit. Like every note had to be calculated. He wanted freedom more than he wanted fame. George was trapped in the middle, quietly dying. He had so much to say as an artist, but nobody was listening. He'd written masterpieces that never got recorded. He'd come up with ideas that got ignored. Lennon and McCartney dominated every session. They got to decide what was important. What was worth exploring. George was the third wheel in his own band. The frustration was eating him alive. He wanted respect. He wanted space. He wanted to be heard. And Ringo? Ringo just wanted to feel like he belonged. He was the drummer, the heartbeat, the one holding everything together. But as the personal tension grew, he felt more and more invisible. The egos got bigger. The arguments got louder. And Ringo just wanted to go home. He was the only one who stayed loyal the longest. But even his loyalty couldn't save something that was already dead. These weren't bad men fighting over nothing. These were artists with genuine, conflicting visions. Paul believed structure saved art. John believed chaos created art. George believed in humility and learning. Ringo believed in just showing up and doing the work. None of them were wrong. They were just different. And those differences, which once made them brilliant together, were now tearing them apart. What Paul realizes now is that this was inevitable. For men can't stay the same forever. Growth means changing. Changing means becoming strangers to people you once knew completely. That's not tragedy. That's just life. But it felt like tragedy at the time. Because they couldn't imagine the Beatles without all 4 of them. They couldn't imagine a world where they weren't brothers. So when it finally ended, it wasn't just sadness. It was the death of who they used to be. There's a moment in every ending when you stop fighting reality. When you finally accept what you've been denying. For Paul McCartney, that moment came on a quiet night in 1969. He was alone. And that's when it hit him. The Beatles were gone. It wasn't the moment John announced he was leaving. That was shock. That was denial. That was the beginning of the lie Paul would tell for 50 years. No, this was different. This was the moment he accepted the truth. The moment he stopped hoping they could fix it. The moment he realized that some things, once broken, can never be repaired. Paul has described it like this: he was sitting at the piano late at night. Everyone else had gone home. The studio was empty. And he realized he was completely alone. The four of them were no longer connected by anything except contracts and money. The love was gone. The brotherhood was gone. The dream was gone. What remained was just the ghost of what they used to be. What happened next would change everything. Paul made a choice that nobody understood at the time. He decided to keep quiet. He decided to let people think he broke up the Beatles. He decided to take the blame so the other three wouldn't have to. It sounds crazy now. But at the time, it made sense to him. Protecting the band's legacy felt more important than protecting his own reputation. Most of us may never become famous. We may never experience what it felt like to be a Beatle. But many of us know what it feels like to watch something beautiful die. To watch a friendship fade. To watch people who used to be everything to you become strangers. We know what it feels like to stay silent when we should speak up. To take the blame to protect someone else. To sacrifice ourselves for something we believe in. That's what Paul did. And he paid the price for it. He went home to his wife Linda and told her the truth. The Beatles were over. She listened. She held him. And then she did something that saved his life. She told him to write. To create. To use his pain as fuel. So that's what he did. He went into his home studio and started writing songs that would become wings. He took his shattered heart and turned it into art. That's how he survived. But the silence was killing him. For years, he woke up believing people thought he was selfish. That he was the one who destroyed the most important band in history. He read the articles. He heard the criticism. He felt the judgment. And he never defended himself. Because defending himself meant telling the truth. And telling the truth meant revealing all the secrets. So he carried it alone. For 50 years, he carried it. At 83 years old, Paul McCartney is not the same man who stayed silent for 50 years. He's had time. Time to heal. Time to think. Time to forgive himself most of all. And now, he's finally ready to tell the story that's been burning inside him for decades. Not with anger. Not with defensiveness. But with the wisdom that only comes from living a full life and looking back with clear eyes. When Paul talks about Yoko now, there's no resentment. He sees her for what she always was, a woman who loved John Lennon deeply. She didn't destroy anything. She just loved him differently than the Beatles loved him. And John needed that love more than he needed the band. Paul understands that now. It took him 50 years, but he finally gets it. He talks about John with genuine affection. They argued. They fought over creative decisions. They had completely different visions for where the music should go. But that wasn't hate. That was passion. That was two artists who cared so much about the work that they were willing to risk their friendship over it. Paul misses John every day. The anger faded a long time ago. What's left is just sadness that they didn't get more time together. George is where the real regret lives. Paul admits now that he didn't give George enough space. He didn't tell him enough times that he was brilliant. That his songs mattered. That his voice deserved to be heard. Here Comes the Sun and Something are masterpieces. But George had to fight for every moment he got in the studio. Paul sees that now. And he wishes he could go back and do it differently. He wishes he could tell George how much he truly respected him. But George is gone. So all Paul can do is tell the story now. Make sure the world knows that George Harrison was an equal. Not a sidekick. Not a junior member. An equal. Ringo gets a special place in Paul's heart. Because Ringo stayed. Long after everyone else had checked out, Ringo kept showing up. He kept playing. He kept believing. He was the glue when the other three were falling apart. Paul didn't appreciate that enough at the time. But he does now. What Paul reveals is that the breakup wasn't about ego or power or jealousy. It was about four men becoming four different men. It was about outgrowing something that once fit perfectly. It was about the cost of success. It was about the loneliness that comes from being loved by millions while being alone with your own thoughts. The real tragedy wasn't that the Beatles ended. The real tragedy was that they didn't talk about it while it was happening. They let the silence grow instead of bridging the gap. They protected the image instead of protecting the relationship. And by the time they realized what they'd lost, it was too late. But Paul is here now. And he's speaking the truth. Not to blame anyone. Not to rewrite history. But to finally let everyone know, especially the fans, that the Beatles loved each other. They just couldn't stay together. And that's okay. At 83 years old, Paul McCartney has finally set the record straight. Not because he needed to prove anything. Not because he wanted revenge. But because the world deserves to know the truth. And the truth is far more beautiful and heartbreaking than any lie could ever be. The Beatles didn't fall apart because of one bad decision. They didn't break because of one person. They evolved. They grew. They became 4 different men with 4 different dreams. And they couldn't fit into the same box anymore. That's not a tragedy. That's just what happens when people are brave enough to become who they're meant to be. Paul's silence for 50 years wasn't weakness. It was love. He loved the Beatles so much that he was willing to be hated so the band wouldn't be torn apart publicly. He loved his brothers enough to take the blame so they wouldn't have to. That's a kind of strength that most people will never understand. That's the kind of sacrifice that defines a person. What Paul wants the world to know is that sometimes the people we blame aren't the real villains. Sometimes they're just caught in the middle of something much bigger than themselves. Yoko didn't break the Beatles. She just exposed what was already breaking. The business deals didn't destroy them. They just made the invisible visible. The creative differences didn't kill them. They just revealed that 4 boys couldn't stay boys forever. The real lesson is this: nothing lasts forever. Not bands. Not friendships. Not even love, sometimes. But that doesn't make those things worthless. It makes them sacred. It makes every moment matter more because we know it won't last. The Beatles gave the world the greatest music ever created. They changed culture. They changed people's lives. And they did it together, even when it was hard. Even when they were falling apart. At 83, Paul isn't bitter. He's grateful. Grateful for the music. Grateful for the brothers he got to work with. Grateful for the journey. Even the painful parts. Especially the painful parts. Because those are the parts that made him human. Those are the parts that taught him what matters. The Beatles story isn't over. It's just different now. It's a story about 4 men who gave everything they had, and then had to let go. It's a story about the cost of success. It's a story about the loneliness that comes with fame. It's a story about brothers who loved each other, even when they couldn't stay together. And maybe that's the most important story of all. But this wasn't the only unbelievable chapter in music history. The next video on your screen reveals an even bigger secret about another legendary band that almost destroyed itself, and how they survived when the Beatles couldn't. Click now to discover what really happened behind closed doors. You won't believe it.